Most knitters are taught the standard method of binding off and have no idea that there are many variations designed specifically for strength, elasticity, and decoration. In this part of the workshop, I'll demonstrate a variety of methods, including the standard, extra flexible, and decorative methods, and ways to bind off to join two pieces of knitting together or to maintain continuity of a ribbed pattern. Now let's take a few minutes to talk about some bind-off tips. The trouble with any bind-off is that it is too often worked so tightly that the edge flares in. And so many of the bind-offs I'm going to demonstrate in this workshop are going to be ways to prevent that tightness from happening, because you want the bind-off row to stretch as much as the knitting below it. Also keep in mind that when a pattern says to bind off in pattern, that means you want to follow the sequence of knit, purl, increase, decrease, and other stitches as have already been established in the knitting that you've already accomplished. So let's start with standard bind-offs. The following methods that I'll show you are related to the standard method that many of us used on our very first knitting project. In addition to this method, there are several variations that will also ensure you get a loose and elastic edge. And all of these methods are going to look pretty much the same. Now, the standard bind-off forms a chain of stitches across the top of the knitting. In this sample, I purposely let them be a little tight to demonstrate the danger of the bind-off being too constrictive. Now I'm going to work the bind-offs in a contrasting color so you can see what's happening. And that doesn't always make the prettiest edge, but I think it helps you to be able to see what the yarn is doing. Now the standard bind-off, you just can use any time. You start by knitting a stitch, then you knit a second stitch, and now you bring your left needle tip into that far stitch on your right needle, lift it over the other stitch and off the needle. That's all there is to it. Now you knit the next stitch, pick the far stitch up and over and off the needle. Knit a stitch, pick the stitch up and over and off the needle. I'll do another one, up and over and off. And now you'll see I've established this line of chain stitches across the top of the knitting. And I've been very careful to be pretty loose, and so you can see that I'm getting a nice amount of stretch there that matches the stretch of the knitting below. And that's what you want to have happen. Now, when you're binding off, go merrily down the row, trying to be careful not to have it too tight. And then when we get to the end of the row, you can get a very loose edge stitch if you knit into that stitch on the needle. See how that's already pulling straight, pulling big? Instead of knitting the stitch on the needle, knit into the stitch that's below the stitch on the needle and drop both of them off, and then bind off that last stitch. And you'll see that I've eliminated that big loose stitch that you can have at the very end. Now another little tip is when it comes time to cut off the yarn, and you finished your bind off, snip the yarn. A lot of patterns will say to take the tail and put it through the last loop and pull to secure. And what have I just done? I've made a little dog ear that sticks out to the side here. And it's not very attractive. So what I prefer to do, after I've cut the yarn and I have that last stitch on my needle, I've bound off the last stitch. Just pull that loop until the tail comes free. And now I've eliminated the dog ear on the side of the knitting.